It's probably worthwhile to take some time to kind of look at political violence and our selective acknowledgement of it. Because the reality is, political violence comes in more shapes and sizes than Pokemon. And yet it's only ever a specific variety that most people seem willing to acknowledge. And then only when it suits the narrative that they prefer to frame. When someone's killed in an act of direct political violence, hand-wringing, condemnation of physical violence, proclamations that we're better than this inevitably follow closely behind. This is true even, or especially, when the violence in question was a direct response to less overt forms of violence. You see, those more subtle forms of violent action are insidious, in that people can easily dismiss them if they're so inclined, but are often, if not always, more harmful. Wilhelm Frick, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Julius Streicher, several others who were sentenced to death following the Nuremberg trials had never killed anyone, and had, to the best of anyone's knowledge, committed no acts of direct violence. In fact, Hermann Göring, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Martin Bormann were among the minority in that they had committed acts of direct violence and murder during their tenure within the Nazi Party. But in 1946, we recognized that political violence comes in many forms, and the guilt of the 12 men who were sentenced to execution was not open for debate. Adolf Hitler himself has never been connected with evidence that he personally murdered anyone, aside from possibly Eva Braun and taking his own life. The same can be said for Joseph Goebbels, though he and his wife killed their 6 children and then themselves. These men, and many others, had been complicit and had knowingly issued propaganda and orders that led to the deaths of countless others. So would anyone like to present a defense that these men were killed, or killed themselves to avoid being killed, because of their political opinions? Is that the extent of cultural relativism that we should be applying to the architects of the Holocaust? Because that's what I keep hearing lately, that people shouldn't be threatened, persecuted, or harmed over a difference of opinion. All I can assume is that many people need to better acquaint themselves with the definition of opinion before they start concerning themselves with differences between them. Opinions are just assumptions. They're judgments that an individual develops regarding any topic. They can be informed or uninformed, but they're little more than a subjective viewpoint with greater or lesser value depending on the expertise and the degree of authority invested in the individuals sharing said opinions. Critiques of policy, ideology, those are political opinions. Whether they're right or wrong, they're opinions. And people are entitled to their own. Hate speech, however, is not an expression of an opinion. Hate speech is an attack, using dehumanizing and demeaning language to target an individual or a group of people based on features of their identity, whether it's ethnicity, nationality, skin color, gender identity, sexual orientation, so on. Hate speech targets often immutable characteristics of the individual or group for the purpose of expressing bigoted, biased, and prejudiced perspectives. Thus, we have the difference between those who condemn the actions of Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government, compared to those who condemn Jewish people or the people of Israel as a whole. One is the criticism of a policy and the actions taken by a group of individuals. The other is a condemnation of a group of people based either on an ethnicity or nationality, depending on whether we're talking about Jewish people or Israeli people. There's a massive difference, and yet we see colleges and universities losing funding because certain people want to conflate these two things with false equivalence. Hate speech is, in reality, a form of political violence that gets shrugged off as nothing more than a difference of opinion, typically by those who are not impacted by that violence. Hate speech and hateful rhetoric paved the way for the Holocaust, along with more recent genocides in Rwanda, Myanmar, Bosnia, Herzegovina. Sheltering hate speech under an umbrella by treating it as if it's nothing more than another legitimate opinion that one is entitled to share is just part of the weaponization of public discourse. It promotes discrimination and violence, especially when it's combined with disinformation and misinformation campaigns designed to reinforce the bigotry involved. Still, one might of course look at the guilty men I referenced previously and argue, well, they were guilty of war crimes. Therefore, the sentences were both just and appropriate. But by that same standard, our current administration should also face a tribunal. Despite no evidence supporting the claims, and the U.S. intelligence apparatus contradicting them. The Trump administration confidently states that Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro is linked to Tren de Aragua, and a U.S. strike on a foreign boat in international waters was justified because that boat was carrying cocaine to our border, sans any evidence. By any standards, killing of foreign civilians in international waters, by definition, is a war crime. The Trump administration is hardly alone in that. Every president in my lifetime has been guilty of actions that should constitute war crimes. Why are we not holding ourselves to a higher standard than we held the Nazis in 1946? But of course, it's not just war crimes that we're dealing with today. The current administration repeatedly flaunts international and American law, violates the Constitution, and works to erode the mechanisms of democracy within America. Men like the late Charlie Kirk have been instrumental in both endorsing and encouraging those actions, as well as being directly involved in helping to place Donald Trump in the position of authority he presently holds. Charlie Kirk himself fostered an environment of white Christian nationalism throughout his life in the public eye. It takes little effort to find several instances of outright racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, and myriad other forms of bigotry in his podcasts, social media posts, and public appearances. He repeatedly expressed a baseless and racist endorsement of the Great Replacement conspiracy, wherein non-whites were coming to America and other Western nations to replace whites. Just last month, he claimed the Great Replacement of white people is far more sinister than any redistricting project. The Great Replacement theory is directly linked to several acts of political violence targeting non-whites. And more importantly, the Great Replacement is virtually identical to white genocide conspiracies that have been core aspects of neo-Nazi ideologies for a long time now. Charlie Kirk accused transgender people of being predators and actively encouraged his listeners and viewers to bully and harass them. Transgender people, while making up a tiny fraction of a percent of the population, are somehow substantially more likely to be victims of violence than cisgender people are. I wonder why that might be. It's worth noting that Charlie Kirk couldn't even manage to consistently maintain his performative support for Israel and condemnation of anti-Semitism, despite knowing that he needed to toe that line because it might be a bridge too far for some of his audience. Nevertheless, he still managed to spout off tired old anti-Semitic talking points about Jewish people controlling everything from higher education to Hollywood, pointing the finger at Jewish financiers of cultural Marxism, and acting aghast at Jewish people promoting anti-white hatred, despite wanting white people to do away with that same kind of hatred against them. To pretend that isn't often political violence is tantamount to saying that violence perpetrated against Jewish people by German citizens in 1940s Europe was not political violence. When the apparatus of government endorses, however tacitly, the dehumanization of a group of people, it requires extensive mental gymnastics to pretend that the acts of violence perpetrated against that group aren't acts of political violence. It also requires an impressive gymnastics routine to pretend that propagandists who spread the dehumanizing message aren't complicit in those outcomes. Was it not political violence when Omar Mateen murdered 49 people and injured 50 others at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida? He may have claimed to support the Islamic State, but his motivations, even according to his father, were based on the same anti-LGBTQ+ sentiment that we hear expressed by nationalists regularly. And since LGBTQ+ rights and the experience of those people are treated as a political football, that would make any violence arising from homophobia and anti-trans perspectives political violence. And this is state-sanctioned violence, because Republicans certainly dedicate a lot of bandwidth to demonizing those people, and Democrats often turn a blind eye to the violence perpetrated against them. And whether liberals want to accept it or not, neglect and dismissal are forms of political violence as well. But that's a discussion for another time. So men like Charlie Kirk, Ben Shapiro, Nick Fuentes, and even Donald Trump, they have a particular skill, even if they lack any others. They can extrapolate from their own insecurities and fears and failures to develop a form of demagoguery that plays on those same weaknesses in an audience. This only works when the demagogue in question is in the majority, because for some people there's always an undercurrent of resentment and fear associated with imagining the loss of power and privilege that comes from being in the majority. Some of that, I'm sure, arises from the assumption that if the roles were reversed, they'd be treated as poorly as they've treated the minority groups within society. Men like Kirk, they taste fear and weakness in their audience that way, in the same way as shark tastes blood in the water. and they're just as predatory about it. They stoke that fear with misinformation and cruelty, dehumanizing anyone that isn't part of that majority group, and assuring the audience that they can rest assured of their superiority. They make them feel threatened by the outsiders, regardless of the fictions required to do so, because they know these people won't risk eroding the false confidence that they've built up by digging too deeply or tugging at a thread that might unravel everything. And as that manipulation leads to the inevitable results, they hide behind a shield of free speech, insisting that they're just asking questions, they're just voicing opinions, or they're engaging in healthy debate. We've seen this happen several times in the past, with January 6th of 2021 as one of the most vivid examples. The architects of the direct political violence are smugly distancing themselves and feigning a sense of horror at what's happening, as they assume no one will recall how openly they encouraged all of it. One way or another, there needs to be consequences for political violence perpetrated by those who conveniently, like cowards, hide behind a misapprehension of what opinion means. And just as importantly, people need to learn that calling for violence against one's oppressors and those who wished or encouraged violence against them is not the same thing as wishing harm on people just because they have a different opinion. Malcolm X wasn't the same as the white racists who fought to maintain segregation and opposed the Civil Rights Act, because he called for reactionary violence. He was already the victim of political violence and was only speaking the same language as those who perpetrated that violence against him. If you threaten someone or encourage others to act violently towards them by dehumanizing them and manipulating others into thinking that they are a threat, you're not expressing an opinion. That isn't merely a differing political viewpoint. And regarding the present situation and the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's apparent assassination, we don't even know for sure at this point if it was an act of political violence. It stands to reason, yes, it probably was, but it's just as likely to be someone who agreed with him on many accounts as it is someone who was politically opposed to every aspect of his ideology, just stripped of the hate speech and the hateful rhetoric. After all, the same people that stormed the Capitol on January 6th of 2021 were the same people that most vocally supported Back the Blue movements and Blue Lives Matter, yet they assaulted police officers without any compunction. When one promotes an atmosphere of hate and fear in which violence is encouraged, we're just as likely to see that violence turned upon the people in the same group the moment any fractures appear. It's worth keeping that in mind.